Good morning, it's Kristen Forster here, a little bit later than normal, and seeking shade under this tree, which gives the dogs an opportunity to kind of spend a bit of time in the water, which as we're... Oh, hang on. There, yeah. This does happen most days. It's just normally happen before I actually start doing my video kind of videoing. And you have nothing to worry. It's all just play. It's just play. I'm giving you kind of extra moments because soon they get bored of it, and then they quieten down. So there you go, some drama and action. It's a good job we're kind of we stream in the kind of wide format, which means you get all of the benefits of the moving action shots right now. Let's see if are they going to go into the water at all? Always makes... Oh yeah, here goes Banjo. Luna following him in, and he's out again. This is just an extra added bonus this morning. I'm so glad we stopped here to do the videoing. Get all this extra fun. What have you got there, Banjo? This is normally Banjo's way of saying, "All right, I've had enough." So oh no, he's off again. Well, this is totally undermining all of the wonderful, thoughtful, peaceful stuff I was going to say this morning. But perhaps it's a little bit more fun. So I tell you what I was thinking about. I was yesterday. I think I mentioned I was up at Ashburn, and we did kind of an introduction to Jesus through the Old Testament. So I was just kind of thinking, and I was thinking as well, because I'm in the process of writing the next little book in the Old Testament series. I need to get back to it. I took a bit of a break over the summer and for slightly longer because I was focusing on getting out the teaching on the tabernacle that did back in July. So I need to kind of get back on top of that. And I was looking, therefore, very deliberately at the issue of the sacrifices. And of course, as I was thinking about them in the light of how they represent Jesus and so on, and it kind of highlighted and just kind of brought home something, which is how much actually in the Old Testament, because actually this isn't where I was intending to go. It's obviously the dogs have distracted me, and I've started thinking about something else now. But there are hugely important themes in the Old Testament that become kind of key to our revelation of Jesus, but which the Old Testament itself actually highlights time and time again. We're not God's original intention, but we're in a kind of accommodation to the people he's talking to, and actually sacrifices are one of those things. The book of Leviticus tells us how to do sacrifice, so we assume it must be God's plan, and it even tells us it soothes him. But almost as soon as the book of Leviticus is written, well, not quite, when I say almost 100 years or so, actually under Samuel the prophet, or 400 years, so maybe that's not that quick, is it? But it's in Samuel who's really at the beginning of, if you like, the Old Testament history period, the Israel's history, as they become a nation, of course, under David, who Samuel is the one who anoints. So if you like, in the nation of Israel, almost straight away in the voice of Samuel, and it's a theme that's repeated right through the Old Testament, comes into the New, is the concept that God never actually wanted sacrifice. He didn't really desire them, but he gave them. And the interesting thing is a huge number, if you like, of the kind of religious structures that shape the Old Testament, we find the same thing. So kings, for instance, God's initial reaction is, you don't need a king because I'm your king, but I know that one day you're going to ask for one. And so kingship is, if you like, an accommodation of God. It's in that sense, it's a temporary... It's something that he recognises will be needed in its context, but it's not the ultimate goal and the ultimate aim. Same thing with priesthood. God first declares, I want you all to be priests, and he says, but I know that's not going to work, so we'll just have to have the Levites. But actually you're all supposed to be priests, every person, because we don't need an extra mediator between us and God. We're going to be given full access to him, and so everyone becomes a priest to everybody else. So here's three major themes: sacrifice, priesthood, kingship. All of which, as the Bible goes on, we kind of get to a point where God is speaking into those things as if they were his kind of ultimate aim and ultimate will, which kind of shows us, in one sense, if you like, the way he accommodates by meeting us in our expectations. But he keeps sowing things in, he keeps seeding things in to say, but actually it's not really there, we're going to have to show you a different way. So I'm going to show you kingship in a different way, I'm going to show you priesthood in a different way. And we're going to see something different in sacrifice, which is not to do with feeding me. And yes, there is something satisfactional in the sacrifice that is eventually going to make all the difference. But it's a sacrifice because actually something in me will die to make space for you. That's what the whole message of God's accommodation is. It's the kind of thing that becomes the big shock and the big surprise. And so within the priesthood, there are verses that talk about an anointed priest. And so priesthood becomes a messianic theme. In Kinghood, there is an anointed king, and so actually we have messianic expectations for God as a conquering king. In prophecy, there's an obvious anointing because you have to be anointed to prophesy. So there's messianic overtones in the ideas of the prophet that Paul actually says and expresses, I wish you all prophesied, because there is an intention from God that everybody should hear his voice and be able to speak with authority from it. So God's intention is not for special class, but for everybody to be involved. But that's another messianic thing, and even sacrifices which are washed and anointed. So the whole idea of the Messiah is given to us in images through the Old Testament, which in one sense we can get to a point, if you're just kind of reading certain sections of the Bible, it looks like it was what God always wanted. And so you meet those believers who can't wait for the new temple with a new set of priests and new sacrifices being offered, but actually they've fulfilled their role. They have led us to somewhere. They always were temporary. So John starts his gospel with those words. I'll start walking now, I think. He starts his gospel with the words, the law came through Moses, grace and truth were realised through Jesus. So in other words, it's implicit in one sense that the law didn't get us to grace and truth. The law is a tutor, says Paul. The things that came through Moses, the things that we hear from God that he wants, were things that were given to Moses in its context, in its time, for a reason. And within that, we find in every major theme, the Old Testament itself qualifies time and time again that they're not God's ultimate intents. And then we get to the New Testament, we find in the mouth of Jesus even more of those things. So it's not what goes into a man, food laws, but it's what comes out. So there was a purpose to it, and those things, line by line, we can have theories and debates, and some things are obvious and other things aren't so obvious. But Scripture itself is very, very kind of clear that there is a progressive process, that God meets us where we're at, and in that context he brings a revelation which is not final destination, but is often the thing that, because of the way that all communication engages someone, and if it engages, it tends to draw them. If it doesn't engage, it leaves them where they are. So God, when he communicates, has had to engage us where we're at, and then within the process of that engagement he slowly woos us. It actually says that in Zechariah, I think, doesn't it? I wooed you, I drew you with the cords of a man. In other words, as if I was human and I was like you, I'm accommodating you and I'm wooing you and drawing you. And so coming back to that verse in John, So law comes through Moses, but there's something in the law that cannot achieve both grace and truth, not in any real sense, because that was realised in Jesus. So the law is a tutor, it's a signpost that points us at something, but also, as Paul points out, it's something that we constantly fail at and we realise it never actually delivers. It's there as a kind of, it has its purpose, and we can debate those line by line, but it's not the goal, it's not the end. And so as I say, I was thinking about these things because I want to write about the institution of the sacrifices and the image that they give us of Jesus, and they show us something. And one of the things they clearly tell us is that there's something in sacrifice that ultimately is going to be satisfactional. something will be satisfied. And in sort of rather simple, crude kind of theological things, we often talk in terms of the ransom paid, the substitute sacrifice, and so on and so forth. But we think about as if actually something is required. We take that verse, it says that there is no forgiveness without shedding of blood. But actually the context of that is that within the law there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. The blood, in one sense, and we talk about in the blood of that they overcame by the blood of the Lamb, is a symbol for something of the life. But the Old Testament tells us that the life is in the blood. So it kind of sets up. I'm giving you a picture to try and understand something, because there is a part of the life of God that has to be sacrificed to accommodate the failings and the flaws and the desire to do things differently in every single human heart. That it is the kind of the great mystery of creation, that a God who is omnipotent, that means he has all power, chooses not to be all controlling, which means that he chooses to restrict his own power. It's not that he has to, but he's by choice he chooses to. If he couldn't, then he wouldn't have been all powerful. If he can't choose to restrain and constrain and focus his own power, then he wouldn't be all powerful. But as someone who is all powerful, he has got that ability, which doesn't take away from his power, because it's by his choice. So God chooses to not be all controlling, even though he's all powerful. He chooses to limit his power, and he chooses for the sake of creating other beings who have freedom. Because if they have freedom, then ultimately they can operate in a way that God doesn't want. But that hurts. Not because somehow God's offended and he's so insecure in himself that if we don't believe what he believes, he gets upset, which is the way a lot of individual humans behave. But actually because he sees the consequences of us acting by giving priority to our limited vision. As I stand here in this field this morning, if I kind of I can see so far, but I need to lift my perspective. I have to have a drone or something, go higher. If I could see further, I might make different choices. And if I was like God, you could see the end from the beginning, then I would choose differently. So he knows that in our limited perspective, as we choose purely on our own volitions without reference to what his heart has revealed to us, it will go badly. It will go badly. And so, anyway, where was I kind of going with all of that? Yeah, that's right. So in that sense, he knows that ultimately someone's going to have to make a sacrifice if there's going to be forgiveness, because all forgiveness requires sacrifice. It requires a sacrifice, though, ultimately. The real sacrifice is made by the one who's forgiving, not the one who's seeking forgiveness. But he meets us, because in all of the cultures around Israel, people offered sacrifices to their gods, and it was about feeding them and giving them food. And so he takes that expectation, he comes into it. But when they've had it for a while, he says, but I never really wanted sacrifice. That's not really what I'm after. What I'm actually after is your heart. This is the way he says it in Samuel, gets picked up later, is in Haggai, I think, isn't it? And it gets picked up in the book of Hebrews, that theme, that he's never really been interested in the sacrifice per se, but he's met us in that place, is the way we do it. And we find the same pattern, exactly the same pattern, is matched out in the life of Jesus. In that people come saying, are you the prophet, are you the Messiah? And they all have their expectations. And Jesus doesn't disavow them. He kind of says, well, follow me and see how it goes. And then there's this huge, huge shock at the end. Because the Messiah they're expecting, who's going to come and cleanse the temple. And Jesus even leads them down the path where they think he's going to do it, because he cleanses it twice in his ministry, at the beginning and at the end. And they're all getting excited and cheering. He's going to be the messianic priest. He's going to take over the temple. But actually Jesus has said this one's going to get destroyed one day. They just haven't heard that, because we tend to hear what we want to hear. And they then think he's going to be the messianic king, and he comes on the donkey, and they're all getting excited about that. What does it mean to be the messianic king, who's going to kick out the Romans and turn it all over again and make us great, and we're going to conquer our neighbours? And he's going to be like the new prophet. He's got these new words. So all of this expectation, and Jesus actually kind of works with it, and he actually gives them good reason to believe he really is, and then he turns the whole thing upside down by getting crucified. And so in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, the Jews sought a sign, and the Gentiles seek wisdom, and this to them looks weak and it looks stupid. It looks weak and it looks stupid. He said, but this is the power and the wisdom of God. It's 1 Corinthians. This is the power and the wisdom of God. And what is that? It is that I meet you in the expectations, but as I meet you in your expectations, I'm going to show you a totally different way. I'm going to show you that omnipotence is not more important than omni-love, if you like, all lovingness. because no greater love has a man than this, than they lay down their life for a friend. And that profound kind of theological tension is something that the Christian church forgets time and time again. I mean, it never totally forgets. There's always a stream, if you look through history, that hasn't forgotten it. But so often it comes down to power looks like this. And yeah, it does, but actually the supremacy of the priority of relationship within the Godhead. Because before God ever was, sorry, that's not right. Before God ever made a decision, I should say, or before God ever took an action, he had to make a decision, decided to act. And his decision was to love between the parts of the Trinity. And so out of that, if you like, the most important existential truth is the idea that God is love. It's more important than God is powerful, because it's his first choice. He was powerful by nature, he was loving by choice. So the first thing that actually represents God's character, which is the more important thing than his nature, is his existential truth, his existential meaning, the meaning that comes out of his life. And it's always therefore so important. As Christians, we recognise he's modelled that in humanity, in Jesus. That actually what makes Jesus who he is not his power. He can walk on water, he can heal the sick. But it is his choice to work with us, to work with our misconceptions, our misappropriated desires, but to build relationship before he tells us the truth. That's why grace and truth is involved. See, and we won't receive truth if we don't have relationship. So he builds the relationship, and then he says, say to James and John, who are saying we should call down fire and smash these places up. And he says, you don't know what spirit you're of. You're not of my spirit. That's not the spirit that I'm showing you. I have that authority and power to do it, but I don't do it that way. It's not the way I do it. I choose to curtail it, constrain it, to actually accommodate you, to accommodate humanity in its failings, even to the point where I know that something in my life has to die to make space for that. And that's the incredible thing, I guess. I say, I guess. Not I guess. That's the reason why I think I couldn't be religious. Although in many ways people would look at me and say I am, but I couldn't be. No, maybe that's not true. I think we all can be. We can all be it if we need to be. But in the end, it's what keeps me doing it. We can do it for a temporary period, but I think it's not sustainable. There's something in our hearts that is just too alive to be able to stick to rules just pointlessly. Is that actually there's this relationship at the heart of it that inspires me and shows me how to live regardless of the rules. And so anyway, final little thought actually, just because I quoted that verse from Corinthians. The Jews sought for a sign, the Greeks looked for wisdom. And the power and the wisdom of God, because you see, a sign is about power. When we talk about signs and wonders, in other words, it's the demonstration. So the Jews were looking for the Messiah to come and give them a sign, a powerful sign. The funny thing is, in the Old Testament, the word for a sign is auth, or out. It's spelt with 3 letters, an aleph, a wav, and a tav. And in the original Hebrew alphabet, which is written with little pictures, it shows a bull, which is the biggest thing you can sacrifice. It shows a nail, or a peg, or a hook, and it shows a cross. And so right from the very beginning, the sign that they've been seeking wasn't a sign of power, it was actually a sign of sacrifice. It was a sign of actually accommodation, and actually that it's God who in the end makes the sacrifice, because the bull, which is the biggest thing you can sacrifice, also in the ancient world was a symbol for God, which is why the ancient Israelites were always making golden cows or calves. It's true across the whole ancient world. You've been looking at my face for a while. I keep pointing this at the dogs, but you can't see them, so here we go. So the Jews have been seeking for a sign, but they never saw that the sign they were looking for would be the crucifixion. That it would be that God so identifies with our fallenness and our sin that actually he actually takes on painfully a model which in the Old Testament law says he's now accursed. God has become accursed. He identifies with our separation from the Father. He identifies with it all, not because he deserves it, but because he wants to reach in and meet us. And so I'm quite encouraged by my faith. I think it's got a lot to say. I think that the world would be a better place if more folks really understood the message, which is not about achieving power and smiting your enemies, there are times when, for the better, for the larger good, those things have to happen. But what's happened is the Christian church has got into a place of authority and power, and it's made that the default. Things that actually got accommodated, it's made its de facto response. That there are places where God has to accommodate and allow the military. It needs to allow the people to behave like those around them. He needs to allow those things, but all the time he's looking to draw us to a different position. And I haven't got time to, as I'm saying each thing, I'm thinking of 1,000 different threads you can demonstrate that with in the Old Testament, but that's not what this is all about, this morning's video. But it's kind of it will hopefully come out as the books develop and they kind of keep on coming. So there'll be a bit of that in the next one. Jesus in the wilderness, signs and wonders, I've called it, as in wandering around, which I need to get written and off to the publisher soon. So for those of you that kind of pray for me and support me in that process, please pray that I actually get my head back into gear on the writing, because I found it very difficult over the last few days to actually force myself to sit down and start again. So I must get into that discipline. But anyway, on this beautiful morning, I will say goodbye to you. We're just slowly walking past the blackberry bushes, as you probably noticed. So Luna's been checking them out. And just kind of a quick reminder as well of what I'm planning come September time, where we'll start this more planned and structured series teaching through every event in Jesus' ministry life. So I'm hoping that those will start coming. They'll be available with notes to watch on the YouTube channel. I'm less than 20 people away from breaking 200 subscribers. So if you've not subscribed yet, it would be fantastic if you did. I don't get any extra benefits for having 200 subscribers on YouTube, but for me it feels good. It feels like we're continually growing. As some of you remember, a couple of months ago when I started doing these, I was aiming to get my first 100. So it's just nice that there's kind of slow growth. Encouraging me to keep doing what I'm doing. And of course, just to mention, as some of you will notice in the links underneath this, I live by ministry. Don't normally say that when I do this, but I do live by ministry. And support and partnership, and if anyone wants to kind of contribute into that would be fantastic. Normally the amounts are so small, and that sounds really rude, doesn't it? But very often, like, it's £5 or whatever. But as much as anything, it's the encouragement of the fact that people do that kind of keeps you going with it. And the funny thing is, it all adds up, and somehow it all works. So I feel very privileged to be able to do it. I don't take it for granted. It's been fantastic that there are those that seem to be so encouraged by what they do that enough kind of trickles in over a month to me I can keep doing this and keep kind of pushing out my on stuff. So anyway, I will see you probably tomorrow. I'm sure I will. But until then, I will say goodbye and sign off. Kristen Forster, Crumbs under the table. Short talks while blogging with my dogs. Just trying to make it all rhyme, but can't quite do it. See you then. Bye.